Last weekend, we heard about how Jesus gave authority to Peter, the first leader of the church. Peter expressed his faith in Jesus. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. But in today's gospel, we see just how fragile we are in our humanness. Because now Peter tries to impose his own ideas on what God's kingdom should be. And Jesus calls him out for being an obstacle. Last time, 2 weeks ago, when I was here on this end of our parishes, I gave kind of an overview of the history of the beginnings of our 7 parishes within Holy Spirit Catholic Parishes family. Just to remind you a moment, we were settled from east to west, all 7 being founded within 30 years of one another, between 150 to 120 years ago. I also mentioned there were several other churches that used to exist, close proximity to our current parish family. By 1920, there were some 15 Catholic churches in our 7-parish family area. And this increase that we saw at the beginnings of our diocese is a visible proclamation, very much like that of Peter's from last week, of the belief that our ancestors had, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. But as we hear today's gospel, to be disciples also means that we must take up our cross and follow him. Every follower of Jesus in every generation will have unique crosses, whether it was our ancestors who had theirs, or that we have ours today, or other Christians in various places around the world have their crosses different from what we have here. One common cross, so we may feel that it's a cross for us, has been the journey of faith and all the changes that came from that. The feeling of the effects of decline within our rural areas. And like Peter, if we were the ones writing the history of the way that God's kingdom would work in our own area here, we might want it to continue to grow and to grow without any difficulty or struggle at all. But the reality is that historically it didn't happen in our area, and it really pretty much doesn't happen anywhere where there isn't struggle or difficulty. So we found that in our past, population in rural Nebraska increased only up until the 1930s. By 1930, our rural population then started to decline. At its high point in our 3 counties in 1930, in Dixon, Cedar, and Pierce counties, we had 39,000 people, but now we're back down to 21,000. Our current population is actually what it was in the 1890s. So what did it look like for our ancestors at that time in the 1890s? What was it like with priests and parishes? Well, in 1890, there were 78 priests that were overseeing 151 different locations. And those 78 priests were serving Catholics that were located in a combined area of both the Omaha and Grand Island dioceses. They were still combined as one yet as that time. So compare that to today. This past year, we had 107 active diocesan priests serving 123 parishes. And so that means that today, we may think about having a vocation crisis, but we actually have more priests right now serving fewer locations across a smaller distance than we had back in 1890 when we had equivalent rural populations. Today, we have 7 parishes that are covered by 2 priests, Father Cordy and myself. And in 1890, our family of parishes at that time was only 6 parishes, and they were covered also by 2 priests stationed in Newcastle and Hartington. At that time, the parishes in Randolph, Osmond, and here in Plainview, you didn't exist yet. Most of the early priests that we had came from other countries, just like the immigrants that came here as well. We didn't really start having enough priests for our area until our priests started coming from Nebraska itself, to have native-born sons that were ordained from our parishes and coming out of families that live here. Our 7 parishes have actually given 22 sons as priests throughout the years. But we've utilized the service of 157 priests throughout our histories. By 1930, that was the height of the rural population, as I mentioned. There were 155 active priests and 55 religious order priests to join the diocesan ones. And at that point, all 7 of our parishes had a resident priest, a resident pastor. And then demographically, a very significant event occurred from 1946 to 1964. You might have heard of it, called the baby boom. During that time, the number of baptisms in the Archdiocese of Omaha went from about 3,100 baptisms per year to 7,100 baptisms per year. Of course, today, we're back to 3,500 baptisms a year, about half of what it was at its peak. By 1968, which was the height of the priestly vocations, there were 209 active diocesan priests and 167 religious order priests. And that really followed along that baby boom. After the baby boom, there also was a boom of priestly vocations as well. And so over 40 years of time, priest numbers in the diocese had an 80% increase in our diocese. Interestingly, during the same time, as I already mentioned, the rural areas continued to decrease after 1930. And so a net result over that 40-year period of time, starting in 1930, was that some parishes closed and other parishes were opened in other places. And overall, there was 40 less churches that existed in our archdiocese through that course of time. As I mentioned last time, and that there were some 15 churches in our area where there's only now 7. Now, there was once a Catholic church in Allen, Nebraska, St. Michael's, but it closed in 1913 after only being around for 22 years. There was a Catholic church in St. Catherine's in Eastbow. In 1951, it burned down, and the same year, St. Francis in Obert closed because of the decline of population. In 1969, St. Patrick at Terre Hill burned down. The 14 families there joined Newcastle. And in 1972, St. Paul at South Creek also burned down, being struck by lightning. And their members joined Ponca. A year after that, 1973, the Our Lady of Sorrows in Carroll closed. And 2 more years after that, the declining population at St. John and Willis led them to decide to close as well. St. Mary's in Belden and Immaculate Conception in Waterbury, they remained opened up into the early 1990s until their membership had dwindled as well and closed. In my Family of Faith video series that I've been sharing at the end of our bulletin flock notes, I have some episodes coming up on the history of each of those different parishes. So if you want to know more about what some of those parishes were like, I have some videos coming up in the future. The purpose for recalling them is not to imply that our churches are going to have to go the same way as they did, but it's to remind us that, while our experience of the faith just change over time, it doesn't mean that it has to go away. We have members of our parishes amongst us who, either themselves or their families, at one time worshipped at those locations. But their faith continues to be lived out, even though those parishes don't exist anymore. So, as I was mentioning, our rural population was declining, but the priest numbers were increasing up until the late 1960s. So those two facts joined together kind of created a sense of an overabundance of priests for a little while. By 1968, all 7 of our parishes had resident pastors, and Hartington and Randolph had 2 priests. They had an associate as well. In fact, Randolph had 2 priests for 24 years straight, and Hartington had 2 priests for over 100 years serving them. Priest numbers, though, wouldn't go up forever. That boom after the baby boom was just temporary. And we tried to, in a sense, lengthen the time of feeling having enough priests for all of our parishes by continually assigning more and more parishes to a single priest. But we could only put it off for so long. Now, the baby boom generation of priests are rapidly nearing retirement. In 1968, there were 17 retired, sick, or absent priests in the diocese. By 2022, there were 81. This year, we had 6 priests retire. In 1890, there were a total of 78 priests, as I mentioned earlier. Well, by 2023, we expect to be down to 80 again. So this means that both our rural population and the number of priests that we have will be returning to the 1880 and 1890 numbers. And I have found it helpful, thinking back as to what life was like for both the pioneers and their priests during that time prior to 1890. One historian wrote that each priest said Mass wherever he happened to be, Vestments and sacred vessels were carried by the priests in his saddlebags. Priests of that period literally lived in the saddle. And it seems to be, again, that that's what life is like for the rural priest. Life in the saddle, going back and forth between parishes, sometimes multiple times a day. With the journey of faith, we've heard various moments of people's sorrow that, our great-grandfathers built these communities, and now we have to give everything up. Has the work of our ancestors been for nothing? If a church closes or if a church doesn't have a weekend mass, does it mean that we abandon everything that has been passed to us? Well, not if we choose to remain faithful. And we can really learn this from the very forefathers who passed on the faith to us. You see, our great-grandfathers, they left their established homes and churches, the churches that their forefathers had built, with little or nothing to find new life here in Nebraska. They lived in sod caves. They battled blizzards and prairie fires and rattlesnakes, grasshopper plagues. Before they had their own churches, they would travel 15 to 20 miles to the nearest log cabin church. And that was across the wild prairie where there was hardly any road, where they had to build makeshift bridges to get over the creeks. They arose early Sunday morning before dawn, just so they could arrive at Mass by noon. They stayed there to share their lunches with each other as a community. They finished with mid-afternoon Vespers before they made their long journey back home to arrive home after dark. That's the faith and determination that built our churches. And what would our founding families of our parishes think of our complaints of having to travel a few more miles in our heated and air-conditioned vehicles on established roads? The supposed hardship of not having everything exactly to the personal convenience that we want. Because they gave up their homes and their churches in Germany and Prussia and Bohemia and Poland and Ireland, but they didn't give up their faith. Just because the place where Mass was celebrated changed for them, they gave nothing of it up. Indeed, it was only strengthened. They picked up their cross and they followed Jesus. And we can do the same. And while Jesus promised in last week's Gospels that the gates of the netherworld would never prevail against his church, he didn't say that we would never have to go through change or suffering. If we wish to return to a time with an abundance of Catholics and priests to serve them, then we must take up the task of sharing the joy of the gospel in the midst of a suffering world. Our ancestors would ask us, what is the foundation of our faith? Is it wood and brick and stone? Or is it the rock of Christ? Is our worship dependent upon one single specific location, or do we worship in spirit and truth wherever his real presence may be? Are we not the living stones that make up the church? And even if Mass ceases in one place or another, it doesn't mean that Jesus is no longer Lord. As one parish history book said it, a church is not a building, it is a people. It was our grandparents and great-grandparents who courageously brought the faith to our beloved Great Plains, and it is we who nurture this prized gift of faith. And as the future ancestors, will pass on the traditions of faith to those who follow.